Now, I'm sure you've noticed by now that doing standard deviation by hand is extremely tedious, very time consuming, and we've had very small data sets of just 10 and 12. So imagine having a real world data set where maybe you have 100 values or 1,000 values or 10,000 values. You don't want to do this by hand. So I'm going to show you how to find standard deviation on your calculator. It's really nice because we actually already know how to do it. It's the same thing for how to find the mean and the median. So when you do that one var stats calculation, you get everything, which is awesome. So what I've done so far is I have already entered my data. So same thing first, you do have to enter your data. So you hit stat, make sure you're on edit. You could hit enter on edit, and you want to input your data. So I just put in the data that we just had for those head concussions, and I already entered it for us. Then what you're going to do is you're going to hit stat again. You want to make sure you scroll over to calc. So if you have a touch screen, you can just touch it, or if you have a regular calculator, you have those arrows. You're going to scroll over to calc, and then you want to make sure you select one var stats. And it will default to L1. So if your data is in list 1, L1, you don't have to do anything else. You can just hit enter. If your data is not in L1, then you can tell your calculator which list to use. You can see down here, you see L1, L2, L3, 4, 5, and so on. And if you hit the second button first, you can then hit 1, 2, 3, and so on, and just select your list. So if I hit second one, it puts L1 in there. And then I hit enter. Now we've seen this before. The X bar is our mean. So there's that 7.5. And we saw the median. So our median also happens to be 7.5 here. I can see my min value was 4, my max value was 10. So it gives me a lot of good information. We'll talk about Q1 and Q3 another day. And our standard deviation is here as well. So remember that this was sample standard deviation, right? Because this is a sample data. So on your calculator, you do want to make a note. SX is what you're going to use for the sample standard deviation. So notice here our answer was 1.9, and you can see that's what this is right here. If I round, that's 1.9, okay? Now your calculator does the calculation for both the sample and the population. So it's going to give you the population standard deviation 2, and it's up to you to know which one to use. You're not using both of these. So your calculator just kind of spits out everything that you could possibly want, and then you have to choose which one's the right one to pick. So if you have sample data like we do here, you're going to ignore this. It doesn't matter. It's useless. It makes no sense here. You're going to choose standard deviation for the sample. So you're going to choose the number next to the SX. If you had population data, like in the last example we had with the salaries, then you would ignore this one and you choose the one that says sigma x underneath it, 1.80. And you get slightly different answers because remember for this one, you're dividing by n, whereas for this one, you're dividing by n minus 1. So that's why they're not the same. This is the same calculation, but divided by n. This is the one divided by n minus 1. So it is up to you to pick the correct answer. Most of the time we're using sample data. So you're going to end up choosing the SX, but it's not always the case. So you need to be careful that you choose the right standard deviation. Now in our example here, the right one was this SX because we had a sample. Okay. And you may be saying, well, how do I get the variance? And to get the variance, you can just square. So the opposite of a square root is a square, right? So to go back to the variance, we can just take our standard deviation and go ahead and square it. And I get 3.5454 and so on. So about 3.5. Now I do recommend using as many decimals as you can when you square. If you don't use as many, sometimes you'll be okay. So that way it worked out fine. Sometimes you may be slightly off. So try to use more decimal places and round at the very end for things like standard deviation and variance. But that's how you can get on a calculator. So the nice thing is that when you run one bar stats, you get not just one thing, but you get a whole bunch of stuff. You get your mean, you get your median, you get your standard deviation. From that, you can square it to get the variance. You have your min value, your maximum value, and so on. So it's a really helpful calculation.